afternoon, team, and thank you for joining today's briefing. Today, we are focusing on how to comply with key legislation that guides our work in the Queensland public sector. This includes Information Privacy Act 2009 Queensland, Public Sector Act 2022 Queensland, Public Sector Ethics Act 1994 Queensland, Code of Conduct for the Queensland Public Service 2011 Queensland, and Public Interest Disclosure Act 2010 Queensland. Understanding and following these laws is essential to protect the rights of individuals, maintain public trust, and uphold the integrity of our organization. Let me outline to you those legislation that I've mentioned. Information Privacy Act 2009 Queensland, an act to provide safeguards for the handling of personal information in the public sector environment and to allow access to and amend of personal information. The primary object of this act is to provide for a fair collection and handling in the public sector environment of the personal information, and a right to access to and amend of personal information in the government's possession or under the government's control unless on balance. Public Sector Act 2020, Queensland, to detail the administration of the public service throughout Queensland. Public Sector Ethics Act 1994, Queensland, to outline the ethical principle and values that the Parliament expect employees of the public sector to uphold, support, and abide by. Under the legislation, each agency is required to establish a code of conduct. The ethics values are intended to provide the basic for codes and conduct for public services. Agencies, public sector entitles, and public officials are not of themselves legally enforceable. Public Interest Disclosure Act 2010, an act to facilitate the disclosure in the public interest of information about wrongdoing in the public sector and to make protection for those who make the disclosure. Code of Conduct for the Queensland Public Service 2011 Queensland, it outlines the expected standards for public sector employees, also emphasizing ethical principle based on Public Sector Ethics Act 1994. The code must align with the Ethics Act. How are we going to access all the legislation? Accessing legislation and guidelines for the employee. Being able to readily access legislation, guidelines, and policies is mandatory to ensuring compliance in the workplace. Employees must be able to direct their colleagues to relevant legislation. This increases awareness of their rights and obligations, and there are numerous ways to stay informed of the latest legislative changes, such as regularly checking the Queensland legislation, checking the public sector internets for updates, attending meetings, seminars, also undertaking formal study like TAFE or university, or reading bulletins, manuals of instruction, and newsletter in the workplace to communicate changes. Or you can also network with other staff in regards of the workplace. What if an apparent conflict arises between legislative requirements? Sometimes legislative requirements may appear to conflict with each other. This happens in number of ways, such as an apparent contradiction between legislation, an apparent conflict between legislation and policy requirements, contradiction between different policy requirements. Where conflicting legislative requirements appear to exist, there are a number of avenues in which you can seek clarification. This is such like, for example, speak to your colleagues or manager about the situation to see if they have any experience in the area. Alternatively, you could consult the specific units within your agency that provide expert advice and guidance on legislation, policy, and guidelines. Contact the relevant ombudsman. The role of the ombudsman is to investigate complaints about the action and decision of government agencies. Contact your union. Union exists to represent the interests of member such yourself. Take the matter to a tribunal. There are many tribunals in Queensland that deal with all kinds of matters. Now, let's discuss about work practices to ensure compliance. This is such only access personal information if necessary, store data securely, report conflicts of interest immediately, and be impartial, fair, and respectful in all dealings. What is compliance? Compliance occurs when your action is accordance to the standard of conduct set under the relevant agencies, policies, and guidelines, and therefore conform with the relevant application legislation. What is non-compliance? Non-compliance arises where standards of conduct enforced by legislation are not adhered to. There are examples of non-compliance. These such as unfitness, incompetence, or efficiency in the discharge of an officer duties, negligence, carelessness, or indolence in the discharge of duties, failure to comply with a code of conduct, contravention of an order or direction given by a superior officer, absence from duty without granted leave or reasonable cause, use of without reasonable excuse a substance to an extent that has adversely affected the competent performance of the officer duties. Let me give you some example scenario on how to respond a possible breach. So the scenario is during your shift, you found a printed document with the client information left on the shared desk. What steps you should do? The step we should do is to secure the document immediately, report the incident to your supervisor or the officer in charge, record the event of when it happened, what happened, and where it happened. And then you have to support any follow-up investigation. How are we going to report breaches? If an employee believes that a breach has occurred or likely to occur, it is important to take necessary steps to report the conduct. There are 4 steps a government agency must undertake if a privacy breach has occurred. These are: contain the breach, evaluate the associated risk, consider notifying affected individuals, and prevent a repeat. Who shall we report? We can report to a supervisor, an officer in charge, the ethical standards unit within the agency or department. There are consequences of being non-compliant. The examples of the consequences is termination of employment, or transfer or redeployment, or imposition of monetary penalty. Let's talk about natural justice. Natural justice is about giving a person who may be affected by a decision fair hearing before the decision made. A fair hearing involves disclosing the critical issues and adverse information to the affected person, giving the affected person a reasonable opportunity to respond and an impartial decision maker. Good communication of decision is essential to fairness, openness, and accountability. Decision makers should provide meaningful and accurate reasons and rights of review or appeal for decision affecting people. Let's talk about workplace role model. Employees should act as role models of compliant behavior. Their actions will create expectations for others, ensuring a high standard is set. How are we going to make sure that we act as a good role model when it comes to legislative compliance? These are the practical tips that can help you act as a good role model. Like, make sure legislative compliance and compliance related issues are always central to decision making. Make sure there is sound understanding of legislation and any recent changes to legislation. Regularly discuss legislative requirements with your manager to ensure that your interpretation of the legislation are correct. Seek feedback on your levels of compliance with legislation and related policy and guidelines. Manage stress and fatigue. Manage physical and mental deterioration. Do not present for duty with alcohol or drugs in your system. Do not present for duty with an injury or illness that may inhibit your ability to perform your duties. Now, we're going to discuss inadequate policies where there is a clear issue with policy. For example, the policy operates to cause a negative impact upon workplace procedure. It should be reviewed. Problem issues with policy may include insufficient financial, other controls, lack of oversight, insecure internet or fax access, non-auditable records of processes, ambiguous guidelines or no guidelines at all, unnecessary complexity, use of out-of-date legislation. In conclusion of this briefing, compliance protects individuals, our organization, and our reputation. It is everyone's responsibility to uphold ethical and lawful standards. When unsure, seek advice and act in good faith. Now, thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Is it legal requirement to notify OIC if potential breach occurred?
That's a very nice question. It is not a legal or mandatory requirement to notify OIC. However, it is a best practice to do so. Not only that OIC can provide advice on responding to breach, OIC also strongly encourage agencies to notify affected individuals. It promotes openness and transparency.
Are employees afforded the opportunity to appeal a decision made against them?
That's also a nice question. Under the legislation Public Sector Act 2022 Queensland, under section 130, yes, the employee has the right to appeal. Is there any more questions you have for me?
No, thank you.
So once again, I'm thanking you so much for listening for today's briefing, and have a good afternoon. And thank you all.